Go for it, Kim.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for getting those invites out, Adam. Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Great to see you guys. I hope you had a lovely 4th of July and some nice time away from your computers and thinking about codes this last weekend. So we've got a packed agenda today to really deep dive and begin our conversations around the commercial code and changes that this board would like to make to the 2024 IECC. So sorry, Adam, I'm going to ask you to make me a host. Or it says sharing is not turned on. Oh, there it goes. Never mind. It went away. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started here today. All right. Cool. So here's our agenda for the day. We are going to start with approving the meeting minutes, as we always do. And then we're going to turn it over to Brad for a quick 10-minute update on the codes work that he is engaged with Department of Energy. And I'm looking forward to hearing that update, Brad, and learning more about what you guys are doing. Following that update from Brad, we'll move into just a really quick review and sort of foundation setting of the statute limitations and EPCA limitations that we need to keep in mind as we move through all of our discussions around the commercial code. This will just really help us try to ground in what we are able to do as we dive into the code discussions and review proposals from the board. The next session will be about 45 minutes, and this is the time where we'll be walking through all of the code board proposals for section C402. So during these first two intro sections today, if you guys want to pull up on your computers, if you're able to, the 2024 draft PDF that you all have received and the copy of all of the board proposals for the commercial code. Having both of those resources up will help you kind of navigate through and figure out where these proposals show up in the code. We've got page numbers and things listed on slides, but I think it'll just be helpful for you guys to have those resources up as we look at code proposals. So for section C402, we're going to look at air leakage, insulation fenestration, and thermal bridging as our primary topics. And we'll discuss the board proposals and see what the board would like to do with those. Our next session is going to be a discussion around section C405-15, which is the renewable energy requirements in the commercial code. And we'll share again a full overview of the board proposals for this section, and then dive into a discussion on how we want to manage this section. If there's time, which that's a big if, I think, we are prepared to dive into an overview of the major changes that happened in section C502 and C503 in the 2024 IECC. The goal of that discussion is to get you guys, since we didn't cover that in some of our initial code overview discussions, to get you guys better primed on what changed between the 2021 and the 2024 in those alterations and additions sections. So that way we can be better prepared for our discussion at our next meeting, which will focus on C406 and 502 and 503. And then we'll wrap up at the end of 2 hours. So lots to get through. Objectives for our day are to make sure that you guys understand before we dive into our code conversations what our statute and EPCA limitations really are. And then we're hoping by the end of this meeting today that we've got some pretty strong direction from the board on where we want to take proposed changes to section C402 and section C405-15. Any questions, concerns on the agenda where we're headed today? Okay. Not seeing any hands. Let's move into approval of the meeting minutes. So meeting minutes from meeting 9 were shared with you all, excuse me, I believe last week. So if anyone would like to motion to approve the meeting minutes, I'll pass over the floor.
Make a motion to approve as submitted.
I'll second.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, all board members in favor of approving the meeting minutes as written, please say aye.
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 Thank you. And any board members that would not like to approve the meeting minutes as written, please say nay. Okay, hearing no nays, I think we can consider those approved. Thank you, everyone. We will get meeting 9 meeting minutes up on the Energy Code Board website shortly. All right, so at this time, I'm going to stop sharing, and Brad, I'm going to pass it over to you, and it sounds like you might have a presentation for the board, so Adam, we may need to make Brad a co-host. And Brad, let us know if you've got access to share.
Working on it right now. And I'll ask here in a second if everybody can. Probably see this, but I'm going to go into presentation mode. Hopefully everybody can.
Yep, all good.
Looks good on this end.
Key to navigate this. Thanks for the opportunity. We're kind of beginning the road show of this. Work is officially kicked off, so kind of starting to develop presentations. So this is good to get in front of you all, and it's good practice for me as I'm starting to develop slides to message some of this info out. So I want to quickly run through some of the work that we are doing and how we got to the point where we're at currently. I'll just kind of jump right into it. So City of Fort Collins, one of the unique things that we've done, and Kim, I recognize that we're tight on time, so holler if I'm running a little long. I'll try and keep track of it. I often say one of the best things that we did was we codified adoption and enforcement of energy codes and on a 3-year cycle, and the code language is there on the left. So we, as a city, are required to adopt the current International Energy Conservation Code with local amendments within 1 year of issuance. Since my time, almost 8 years with the city, I've run up against this twice and had to use this code language. So it's been really beneficial. I always recommend that people, if they can, codify this into some sort of a policy, whatever they're developing. We are currently on the 2021 version of the International Energy Conservation Code. We adopted that April 15th of 2022, and we typically amend the code to align with our climate plan. Our driver is that, our climate commitment, and you can kind of see on the screen where we're headed. We have reached our 2020 target. We exceeded 20%, not by a lot, but we did exceed by a little bit. Our next target is an 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by year 2030. This is a big task. We are forecasting that we will not hit that. We're going to be at about 70%. So what that means is that every little effort that we make really matters. So that extra 10% is going to be really difficult. And then the city as a whole carbon neutral by 2050. City of Fort Collins developed an Our Climate Future plan in March of 2021. That plan is made up of a number of what we call big moves. And within those big moves, we have Big Move 6, which is efficient emissions-free buildings. And those are big moves are supported by next moves or supporting moves. One of the supporting moves is to develop an energy code that is a performance path for new construction to zero carbon building by 2030. I think when I speak to this, I say 2030 code more than I say year 2030, although we will adopt the 2030 code, should be targeting year 2031. So for us, what does that look like? We're planning a performance path for a number of reasons, but the biggest thing and the direction that we're taking is that it provides transparency. I'll go into a little more detail on what we're planning to do. This allows the building industry to kind of develop a little bit of a planning effort on like where things sit right now and where we're headed by 2030. We will now know that, and we will message that out to the building community regularly. Performance Path also provides flexibility. It allows builders just to hit these energy targets and choose their path to reach those targets. It also provides real energy outcomes. So we will know through projected modeling or proposed modeling what the kilowatt hours or therms are, although I suspect that we will move more and more away from therms It is called a zero carbon code for a very specific reason. And then it also it allows for data-informed decision-making. That's the whole basis of why we decided to move in this direction. We'll touch on that just a little bit more in a second. So one of the unique things was that as we were planning this, the Department of Energy released the first funding opportunity as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. In 2022, that was $45 million over a 5-year period, and they were anticipating somewhere between 10 and 30 awards. What I was planning at the time really kind of ticked off all of the areas of interest you see on the right: state and local code adoption, workforce development. Part of our work is going to tie into a scholarship program that we have just developed in the city of Fort Collins for building industry workforce. Implementation and compliance, this is the big chunk of my work: innovative approaches, energy, equity, and environmental justice, and partnerships. If you aren't familiar with it, the primary goal of this funding is to advance building energy codes and other building efficiency policies in a region, state, or jurisdiction. So we submitted full application March 27th of 2023. We were officially awarded July 12th of 2023. This was my first big grant, federal grant, and I recognize, I'm sure Adam will kind of chuckle a little bit at this because he's going through this right now, but we were awarded in July, but it took months of work before we officially received the agreement from the DOE, and have just recently been able to kind of kick off work on this. The goal of this project is to really develop a methodology that establishes energy use intensity, or KBTU, per square foot, building square foot energy targets, and CO2e, carbon emission reduction targets. The plan is to document a baseline performance from utility data. We are a municipal utility, so we have utility data, and our benchmarking program. So we will know where buildings are starting at right now, and we will know what it's going to take to reach 2030. The plan is to engage stakeholder group. There's going to be a big equity focus on this. This has been a bit of a challenge for me. I didn't realize the equity component to this takes a lot of work if you're really going to do this in a meaningful way. The plan then for us is to develop and adopt this performance code. So again, people will be targeting energy use per square foot by building type. That's what they'll be constructing to. And then along with that, we plan to create an implementation guide and trainings. And then the benefit to us being a municipal utility is we'll be able to evaluate the effectiveness of this from an implementation and compliance standpoint and through utility analysis. So the idea is 2024 code, 2027 code, ultimately zero carbon by 2030 code. We will be able to take the code that we adopted, do utility analysis, look at the performance data, and find out if we're on target with some of the energy use per square foot targets that we've established. We are the lead. Florida Solar Energy Center is a partner. New Buildings Institute is a partner. Energy Code Council will be working to help us develop the code language and implementation guide and training, and our supporting state agency is the Colorado Energy Office. This kind of provides a little bit of a timeline of what things are going to look like within the next 2 to 3 years. We're in the middle of just starting to, I shouldn't say middle, we're just starting to develop those methodologies that establish the EUI targets. The plan is fourth quarter of this year, first quarter, develop the code language. It'll likely sit as an appendix that we will adopt in its entirety. We'll then create the implementation guide, be doing training. This will be something that we'll plan to roll out through this group and through Adam and the Colorado Energy Office. Our next step is once we develop all that, we do community engagement and ready for council adoption, planning about a year from now, again, a year from issuance of the current version of the International Energy Conservation Code, which fingers crossed we see soon. And then we begin, once people start building to this code, we begin to evaluate, measure, and adapt, as I mentioned before. One benefit to this that we're realizing is that all of these code paths within our building services division, plan review, building inspection, it's a bit of a challenge for our team to navigate all of these different code paths. So we're going to put one code path in place, and hopefully ease the workload a little bit. They'll know exactly what they're reviewing to, and they'll know exactly what they're inspecting to in the field. Most people have seen this. I just like to show this because the following slides will provide a little bit more context. For our purposes right now and the work that we've done to date prior to starting work on this DOE project, we've been tracking energy use, but this gives you an idea of where the 2021 code sits. And what we're kind of assuming is that zero carbon or zero energy means that we're going to have to reach a certain building load where renewable energy can kind of take over and then take us to zero. This is kind of the hypothetical look of what we think that might look like. This gives us kind of an idea. I think most people know that the International Energy Conservation Code 2024 version is projecting about a 6% increase in efficiency. So it gives you kind of an idea across all climate zones and nationally, you know, really how far off we are. This is nationally. Here's the good. If you aren't familiar with some of the work being done through the Building Energy Codes program, the state of Colorado has done residential energy code field studies. The benefit to this is we kind of already know in climate zone 5B, which is the majority of certainly the front range of Colorado where a lot of the building takes place, what that energy use intensity or kBTU per square foot is. Right now, we're looking at about a 30.7. So really not too bad. Certainly room for improvement and certainly a long way to go before we reach an area where buildings can have 100% renewable offset to take them to zero. Now, I mentioned City of Fort Collins as a municipal utility has done their own analysis. So we've been tracking this for a number of years, and this is actual City of Fort Collins energy use for residential homes and by code year. I started doing this when I came on board at the city because if we were going to implement a stringent energy code and kind of continue to ramp up efficiency within energy code and amendments that provided a bit of a stretch, I wanted to make sure that each code cycle we were actually reducing energy use in our homes. We were able to track this. Our current data goes through 2018. We're working on 21 right now. We expect to have that pretty soon. But this gives you kind of an idea of where we are sitting right now. You can see the gray box, the state average EUI of a 30.7. City of Fort Collins comes in at about a 28. So we do have some amendments that strengthen it. And I was hoping that we would perform a little bit better than state, and we do. So thankfully, that was a whoo when we were doing this analysis. So this gives you kind of an idea of what we're projecting.
Brad, I just want to say maybe one or two more minutes.
We're pretty much wrapped up. So this is the last slide, really. So this gives you kind of an idea of what we're thinking. This is what it would kind of look like as that stepped approach. And you can see historically some of the jumps in efficiency that the codes have taken. I don't expect 2021 code to be as big actual as what we see on the dotted line there. I think it'll be closer to the 2018 from some of the things that I've seen citywide. So it does mean that we do have a fair amount of work to do. So that's what it kind of looks like. That's a quick, very quick overview of the project that we're starting. I'll invite the group to visit fcgov.com/zero carbon code. We just established a website. It's pretty elementary right now, but it's going to kind of track this work. You can also find an email from there. If anybody has questions for me specifically about this, certainly reach out anytime, and I'll plan to kind of circle back with the group and connect with Adam and his team to share more information as we develop. All I have, so hopefully not too bad time-wise.
Awesome. No, I think you nailed it. Thanks, Brad. Carolyn, if your question's super quick, I'll let you ask it, but otherwise I might ask you to follow up with Brad offline so we can make sure we keep moving today.
Yeah, no, just really quick question, Brad. Are you setting EUI targets for all building types? Is that your goal?
It is, correct. Yeah. And the building, we've abused, which is our building energy and water scoring. So using that classification of buildings from our benchmarking, and then also what we've done with Florida Solar Energy Center in the past for residential buildings. So kind of classifying them that way. So covering all. The hard part is we don't have all building types in Fort Collins. So we're going to have to rely on some data that we don't have, probably from CBEX. I think probably most people are familiar with that, but what we do have, we'll kind of see how closely it aligns to CBEX data. And am I done? Did I stop sharing? Oh, no.
You did not.
Stop share. Okay. There we go.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Brad. And I see Tim dropped a question for you in the chat, so maybe I can keep us moving if you wanted to address that. And then, yeah, board members, I think just feel free to reach out to Brad if you have any other questions that you guys would like to ask him. But in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving through our meeting today. And Adam, I'm going to pass it back over to you to talk through just a quick refresh on the statute and EPCA limitations.
Sure, thanks. Go on to the next one. There we go. So I think we have talked to all of you ad nauseum about the state statute requirements, but I think there are still some questions that arise about it periodically, and so we just kind of wanted to remind everybody about what we are limited with, and what we are allowed to do based on the state statute, just so that everybody can have those fresh in their mind as we're going into the conversations about what we want to do with the code. So I think the big one that we are aware of, and that we typically the most questions about, like what can we do and what can we not do, come up in regards to, is that first bullet, which is allowing the board to modify the IECC, including appendices. And when we talk about weakening or strengthening stringency of requirements, I think that's where most of the questions come up. And so just wanted to give a refresher that the board is allowed to weaken the stringency of any requirement of the IECC. I guess it should also say, or any of the appendices. And just as a blanket statement, if it's weakening the requirements of the code, the board is allowed to do it without restriction. The challenge obviously comes as when we're talking about strengthening any the stringency of any provisions. There are limitations on how we can do that. And so I think that there have been questions about whether or not we can strengthen provisions. And the answer is yes, the board can strengthen provisions. However, it needs to be done through adoption of language from one of the appendices, either as it's written or as it can be modified. And by modified, we either mean neutrally or weakened from the way the appendix is written now. So there are opportunities to strengthen the code. And I think that's a really important point, is that adopting appendices is strengthening the code. If you adopt the appendix as it's written, or if you use an adopted appendix in some modified fashion to modify other provisions of the code, that's fine. And that is what the board is allowed to do. And then I know there's often been questions about what jurisdictions are allowed to do when adopting, which we can go more into. I know that there are sometimes questions about that, and we can talk about that if folks have continued questions on that. But just want to remind everybody that we cannot just go in and prescriptively update like one of the prescriptive requirements and require a stronger metric or a stronger requirement to be in effect. But if there are appendices that address those issues, we can use those to strengthen the base code. So hopefully that answers everybody's questions in regard to that. As David and I have said consistently across the process, what that might look like for individual provisions might depend. And so we can address that. If folks have a question of like, are we allowed to do this per state statute? We can address that on a case-by-case basis. But just wanted to remind everybody that strengthening is allowed through the appendices, but weakening is allowed under any circumstance. And then the second one there is just reminding that the electric, solar, and EV ready requirements will be part of this code, and we're going to have discussions later on about updates to those. The next three, I think, are, Tim, I'm going to run through these and then I'll get to your question. Next three are just reminding everybody that the statutory considerations that are top of mind for the board should be that we are tasked with maximizing carbon emission reductions while also maintaining housing affordability, considering how those will affect housing affordability. So those are the top two priorities that the statute tasks us with. Reminder that we must provide compliance pathways for all electric and mixed fuel in both residential and commercial. That'll come into play a little more when we talk about EPCA. And then this last bullet is the one that it can be a little confusing when you read it, but I think that ultimately a lot of this will be determined about whether or not the board decides to maintain any mandatory on-site renewable requirements. If it does not, then there's nothing to exempt. If we do, then we will certainly discuss what that means from exempting electricity consumption. Next slide. Just a reminder that this code cannot require replacements of a system that fails at the end of its useful life to be pre-wired upon replacement. And it cannot require replacement to be a different fuel source than the equipment was originally. So let's just use this as an example. If you have a home where the gas furnace goes out at the end of its useful life, this code cannot require that person must replace that equipment with something other than a gas furnace, whether that's electric or propane or whatever it may be. We cannot require that they do something other than the fuel that it was using already. And that will also not require that equipment to be pre-wired. So our electric ready code will apply for new buildings. And if a renovation is happening where you are taking equipment out or replacing equipment voluntarily, the pre-wiring can apply. But if it's just at the end of useful life failures, pre-wiring and fuel switching is not going to be something that this code can require. And then just reminding, since I know refrigerants have come up a couple of times, that the code cannot restrict the use of acceptable refrigerants, and acceptable refrigerants are all the ones that are identified by the federal government, the EPA, as being acceptable and allowable refrigerants. Next slide. Okay, the next one's EPCA. So let's go back to the statute one, and Tim, I'll let you ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Going back to the question and the clarity of that first bullet point, and in particular, the UCB may only strengthen through appendix language. So we move into our specific comments that a lot of the board members made, and some were proposing to strengthen portions in the body of the IECC. So now I understand, and that helps me, I think, clarify it, is that the only way the board could do that is if there was appendix language that would work, either bringing the entire appendix in, which I think some of these are being proposed to do, or finding one of the appendices that has, say, language like strengthening insulation and fenestration, one of the first ones that we're going to talk about from Brad, that couldn't be done just from the body. It would have to be done from appendix language and then brought in somehow. Okay,
yeah, that's right.
That'll help a lot as we move forward with some of these questions on the proposed strengthening of the body of the code. Thank you.
Yep. And I will just note that as we are talking about those proposed strengthening proposals, there is going to be some discussion about, well, we might not be able to do it the way it was proposed, but is there another way we could potentially try to reflect the same thing in a way that is allowable? So that will be part of the discussion. Any other questions on the statute before we move on to EPCA? No? Okay, let's go to EPCA. So I will preface all of this by saying I really don't think EPCA considerations are going to be a huge challenge for this board, just because of the statutory requirement for pathways for all electric and for mixed fuel buildings. But just wanted to remind everybody, since I know it's been brought up a few times since we last talked about it, what EPCA is and what the potential limitations are. And I want to emphasize, as I think Kristen did at one time, the limitations from EPCA are potential limitations, and we don't necessarily have firm answers of like, can we do this or can we not do this? It might be one of those, is it risky or is it not risky type of discussions. And so just EPCA brief overview gives the Department of Energy authority to set efficiency targets, efficiency standards for covered equipment and appliances. That does not necessarily mean that all equipment and appliances are covered by the standard. I think there's like 60 something products and equipment that is currently covered, and others are allowed to be governed by the states. It preempts state and local governments from requiring different efficiency standards in building codes. And just noting that we have, the IECC generally aligns the minimum efficiency requirements on equipment with those federal efficiency standards. So we shouldn't have to worry too much about the IECC stepping out of bounds on that, but noting that the board can't just go in and say, well, we decided that we want minimum efficiency for air source heat pumps of a certain capacity to be higher than the federal minimum. The EPCA statute clearly prohibits us from doing that. And I don't think we've seen any proposals to do that, but just reminding everybody that we cannot do that in a mandatory way. And that state and local governments can set standards that are higher, or whatever standards they would like for products that are not covered by the Department of Energy's covered products list. Next slide. So just a reminder on the recent legal situation around EPCA. So the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Alaska, as you can all see on that list down there, that it prohibits bans, which is kind of a double negative, prohibits bans on gas connections to appliances or equipment in building codes. Essentially, what that functionally means is that there must be a viable pathway for non-electric appliances or appliances really of any fuel source to be allowed in the building code. And as noted there, because this ruling occurred in the Ninth Circuit, it only applies in the states that are covered by the Ninth Circuit, which Colorado is not part of. So again, when we talk about limitations, these may be more real limitations in those states, whereas in Colorado, it's more of talking about risk and possible limitations. And then just...
Can I just add one thing, Adam?
Yeah, please go ahead, Dave.
I just want to add that it's not clear that that was decided correctly. And I think nationally, this is probably all going to end up at the Supreme Court at some point. There's cases coming up in different states. There's rules and ordinances and laws in different states. As Adam said, this ruling doesn't necessarily apply in Colorado, although there are folks who would like it to. So it's all in flux.
Yeah,
that's just what I wanted to add. Thanks.
And so I think that I think to that point, and the points we've been trying to make is that really the point in saying this to all of you is to keep it in mind as being something that we should be aware of and something that we should consider the possible ramifications of, but that this ruling does not apply to us and that it may ultimately change if there are circuit splits and if the Supreme Court becomes involved in deciding this at a national level. So happy to answer any questions. I think a lot of these will be more questions that arise in individual discussions, but happy to talk about it. Carolyn?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Adam. And I just wanted to say, I think when we get into the point section is probably the most relevant time in which we really want to think about the EPCA considerations, not the fuel choice for appliances, because I don't believe we're taking that up, but the allowances in EPCA to, offer point options for things that exceed code minimum efficiency have some pretty very specific requirements around it. And so I think we just want to keep this in mind when we get to the crediting system discussion, because there has to be equivalency and analysis that supports anything that includes a provision that sets a performance specification for a covered appliance higher than the code minimum, which is in the point system now. As it exists, is we just want to make sure we're preserving that and considering it. So I think that's where the EPCA piece is going to play out for us as a code board, as opposed to the Berkeley issue that was really specific around electric only options.
Thanks, Carolyn. And just to remind everybody too, I think the word viable is really important to consider here, is that there must be a viable pathway for alternative fuels to be used. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be on an even playing field. It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to, so long as it is achievable to get a or any fuel type be used in a building using minimum efficiency equipment and be able to meet the code. So just pointing that out. Any other thoughts, questions? Not seeing any. Okay, well, we have a lot to get to, so I'm going to move us on.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam, for going through that overview with the board. So now we're going to jump into today, which is a commercial code discussion around the code proposals that were submitted by the board for section C402. So if folks want to, again, pull up your IECC versions on your computer so you can follow along. I think that will help aid in the discussion today. And before we jump in, I just wanted to give a quick reminder to folks on how we will sort of use voting in these early phase meetings to help us move the conversation along and help our team understand where the board would like to make changes. So for these early discussions, we are going to do a majority vote from the board members present in the meeting on if they would like to move forward with the change that's being proposed or not move forward with the change that's being proposed. We're gonna see if we get to any voting today. I'm not entirely sure. We'll certainly focus on discussion, and if we feel like we're getting to a point where the board feels resolved on an issue, we can bring it to a vote. We'll vote using the hand raise function. So, and if you have an issue or any troubles with that, we'll, any votes are welcome to come in through chat or verbally. But just to help keep things streamlined, we'll try to use that hand raise function. And just as a major reminder, these initial votes where we're doing majority vote of board members present are simply to give our team the direction we need to move forward with some of these, the code drafting of these different elements. As we get through our process and towards the end of this whole effort, all of our final voting will require a 2/3 majority of board members to approve the measures, and that includes all board members, not just those present. So just really want to distinguish that final voting will happen at the very end of this process, and as we move forward through these conversations on the earlier side, we're going to use that majority vote principle. Okay. So jumping right in, our first topic we wanted to cover today is the comments that we received around the air leakage sections of section C402. We received questions from the board as well as neutral and weakening suggestions from the board. So we'll start with a quick review of the questions and then we'll go into the code proposals. So I'm going to read these questions. And then first and foremost, I'm going to turn it over to Anna and Hope to provide any thoughts on these questions. And then we'll open it up to the board for any additional thoughts that folks might have. So the first two questions, I think I could kind of bucket into one here. What do testing agencies think about the tightness targets? And are there enough available third-party raters for air leak detection? So I'm going to start with those two questions and move on to the final two in a minute. But Anna or Hope, any initial thoughts on these?
Yeah, so Group 14, we do air leakage testing. And I talked with our building enclosure team about the new requirements, and they do not have any concerns about the tightness targets. Most of our buildings that we are testing right now would already meet these requirements. And then we have not seen that there are not enough third-party raters for air leak detection. Typically, we're bidding on projects against multiple other companies. So seems to be quite a bit to go around.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. Hope
Yeah, the only thing I would say is speaking commercially, the air leakage testing requirement or option has been in the code up until the 2021, where it kind of became basically mandatory. And it wasn't an option that was utilized very often. And because of that, whereas on the residential side, contractors have had the opportunity to fail and learn from their mistakes and build upon that. Commercially, we haven't seen a whole lot of that. Now, I agree that there are a lot of projects out there that Group 14 has done. And I think, I'll be honest with you, it's because of the efforts of Group 14 to get them to the point of passing those tests. But anybody, and I'm not saying that there aren't other companies out there that could do it that wouldn't be as helpful and knowledgeable as Group 14 is. But there's a lot of commercial projects out there that I do know have failed in just trying to get to that 0.40 under the 21 and not even the new numbers that are in the 2024 of the 0.35. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of failures, at least in the beginning because people have to figure out what works and what doesn't work. As far as enough third parties, I think there are I-25 mostly in the north and north of probably Colorado Springs, Pueblo of the I-25 corridor. But some of the more remote areas, they can't even, it's very difficult for them to get those third party raters for residential. It might be a little bit more difficult on the commercial side, but then again, you know, how much commercial construction are they doing that this would even fall into those parameters? But we do have to take that into account. Denver metro area, I-25 corridor, mountains, we probably have quite a bit. Those outlying areas, those rural areas on the eastern side and down south, that may be something to consider.
Okay. Thank you both so much. Any follow-up questions from the board on those first two bullet points, first two questions? Yeah, Kim.
I just echo from a personal experience with as being a rater out here in a rural, remote mountain community. And I've said it before, there is a workforce shortage for third-party inspections. However, it's strongly encouraged that that not be a limitation on what goes into the code, but more an emphasis on workforce development, because I think it can be met that way instead. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim.
Yep, thanks.
Carolyn.
Yeah, I was gonna make a comment similar to Kim's as well, which is when you consider the timing of when jurisdictions have to adopt this code, I do think that there's going to be a lot of those lessons learned that Hope discussed already happening from jurisdictions who are already adopting these requirements into their existing codes. And so I don't know that it should be a limitation of where we exist today. Acknowledging that we have quite a number of years before it becomes a real impediment to implementation. So
Awesome. Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, so I'm going to move us on to the second two questions on this page. And Kevin, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to just flag that these came from you since it's in the document anyway. So for that first question, what are the cost and scope implications of C40 2.6.2, which is the air leakage compliance section, which can be found on page 189 for those of you following along in the code, and how does it differ from current requirements? So Hope and Anna would love you guys to chime in on that one. And then for this final question, what are code officials' responsibilities regarding the air testing reports? And so I think Ron and Tim and Carolyn, we would love some thoughts from the folks who are code officials on this board on kind of what that section means for you all as far as additional workload and effort. So we'll start with that first question. So Anna and Hope, over to you.
Yeah, so Hope, feel free to jump in here. My understanding, I don't have a good sense for what exactly the cost will be to meet the new requirements of the air leakage. There's going to be an increased cost to provide the details that are required and the level of construction that's required, construction detailed work that's required to make sure that we are meeting the air leakage requirements of the code, especially considering that if the test is failed by a significant margin, there has to be mitigation. And that's where I think the risk comes with the 2024 IECC requirements. Not necessarily meeting those requirements for all projects, but the potential for those projects who fail by a significant margin to have to mitigate the problem.
Yeah, and as far as the cost goes, I don't know that there will be a significant cost to those that were on the 21 because this was already something. It's a little bit beyond obviously what was in the 21. There will be an additional cost if a jurisdiction is on the 18 or older codes because they would not have had to include this as part of it. As far as additional responsibilities for the code officials, when you go to C402.6.2.1, that's the testing options. So when it comes to the code official, all that they're going to do is they're going to review those reports and the information. So there's not an additional items to that. Now, where Anna had mentioned about the getting the detailing and all that, that cost may be there, but the requirement for all of that information to actually be provided on those plans has been in the code for a long time. It's been overlooked by a lot of the designers and code officials alike. So I think there is some cost that's going to be there. And I think part of the cost is going to be time back and forth. So I would say keep that in mind too. It's not necessarily cost of drawing it out. It's the back and forth ordeal, because they will not have provided on that first go around. I don't know how many times I write that up in a review comment to provide that, unless I get something from group 14, which I love. But yeah, I think that's some of the costs to think about too.
Adam, maybe do we have a sense statewide of like how many municipalities, I'm thinking more rural communities, that wouldn't be as, on an aggressive adoption schedule? Like how many people might be back on 2018 and not have any of this, currently contemplated?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kevin. So in terms of it's a big difference between, in terms of like number of jurisdictions where that is the case versus like which jurisdictions have moved forward that have most of the construction, right? So most of the jurisdictions that have the vast majority, certainly of large commercial construction, are on 21 now. Not all of them, but most of them. And in terms of the number of jurisdictions, it is only about like a quarter of the total number of jurisdictions, even though it represents like 2/3 of the state's population and probably more than 2/3 of construction in the state. So I think that the challenges would be a lot of times in those more rural communities that tend to be on the older codes currently. And to Carolyn's point, those jurisdictions still have, 2 years to choose 2021 instead of this code anyway. And so they could make a more incremental jump in that interim period. But that is where we kind of stand in terms of who's on 21 and who's not. And I guess I would note too that the majority of the jurisdictions who are not on 21 are either on 15 or 18. Is a large majority of those. So
awesome. Yeah, Ron, do you want to jump in and share any thoughts?
Sure. So a couple of things. One, when we talk about the cost to comply with some of these things, I think it's important to recognize that it's not a straightforward relationship, meaning that the actual cost to comply with these is not that high once the contractor and design team has learned how to do it. There's sort of this initial learning curve that needs to take place, and that does take a bit of effort, extra testing and contractor training. But then after that, it's actually relatively inexpensive to implement these things. So there is this initial resistance when people don't really know how to do it, and then it's pretty straightforward after that. And the same is true actually for the reporting. So when I'm working with a design team or contractors who maybe I haven't worked with before and they don't know how to put together these reports, or they have confusing information on the reports, it does take a little bit of time as the code official and my team to give that feedback. But then once we sort of understand what's expected, they understand what's expected, we understand where to be looking for things, these things are relatively painless to review.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron. And yeah, Carolyn, I'm going to take one more thought and then I'm going to keep us moving through our proposals.
Yeah, I'll turn it around on Kevin. So Kevin, what's it cost to do it in Boulder? Because we've had almost this environment since 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm asking the questions like, I think it's the right thing to do, and I don't think it's that complicated for us to include.
Okay.
I think, as Ron is suggesting, kind of learning that language as it comes around, and knowing kind of the hot points in the documentation. I think that's a big part of it. And then I think the execution of it, Carolyn, is more like, I don't think it's too impactful on the design side. I think, as Anna was saying, if you have a situation where you've gotten really far down the road and you test and all of a sudden it fails,
Right.
what are your opportunities to remedy? And that, I think you could get kind of caught into, are you tearing out drywall to check an air barrier, exterior materials, things like that. I think envelope compliance and third-party inspections are going to become even more important. I think most of the large commercial projects we work on already have that. And I don't know how much of that goes on in the residential sector when we get to that portion of the code. But I think it's going to be heightened awareness for sure. There's going to be a lot more attention paid to it. I just don't think it's a ton of extra detailing particularly.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because I mean, like I said, we've been requiring air leakage testing and remedy in our code for some time. But again, we're not like the massive growth community out there. So there's few projects and the ability to work, but I don't see it as a huge barrier. I think the remedy portion of it is an interesting one for us to really think about what flexibility is left to local jurisdictions to deal with the consequences of not meeting the air leakage. Like how far do they have to go to remedy?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And Tim, and Ron, I really appreciate the continued discussion. I'm wondering, would you guys be okay dropping your questions, comments in the chat? I just want to make sure we get through the proposals that we need to get through today. So I appreciate both of you, and I don't mean to silence you. I wish we had all the time in the world. So I'm just going to keep us moving just to make sure we get through all of this. So we had 4 proposals to change the language in C402. And these are all weakening and or neutral proposals. And so per Adam and I's review, we believe that none of these will run up against statute limitations. So we'll go through these one by one, and we've got the code language pulled up on the slide, so you guys can kind of look through it. So the first proposal here is to add a section to the end of C402.1 to have to ensure that there is clearly identified air barriers and boundaries listed on the construction drawings. So the proposed language is in red, and I'll just read this section out loud. So this is section C402.6.1, air barriers. Reads, a continuous air barrier shall be provided throughout the building thermal envelope. The air barrier is permitted to be located at any combination of inside, outside, or within the building thermal envelope. The air barrier shall comply with section C402.6.1.1 and C402.6.1.2. The air leakage performance of the air barrier shall be verified in accordance with section C402.6.2. The added language suggestion from the board, the air barrier boundary limits and size of the surface area, floor, wall, and ceiling or roof of the building air barrier and of the zone or zones to be tested for maximum building air infiltration and exfiltration shall be clearly identified and approved on, shall be clearly identified on the approved construction drawings. So, would love to know board thoughts. I believe this was, well, I'd have to actually go back. I think this was, who proposed this one?
It was me, Kim.
Brad. Thanks, Brad. Yeah, so feel free to, I was going to say, I think it's Brad, but feel free to jump in, Brad, if there's anything you want to add context-wise, and then we'll just open it up for board discussion.
I'll keep it really brief context-wise. And for those that don't know, the city of Fort Collins has been performing commercial building air tightness testing for approximately 12 years now. Our metric is 0.25 CFM 75 per square foot of envelope area. It is pretty common, if this does not exist on the construction documents, that we see different numbers from the architect, even the builder, to the test firm. So just wanting to kind of codify this a little bit more so that it's becomes like on an approved document at time of test, so that we don't run into, often if I go out on one of these air tightness tests, it's like, what numbers are we looking at? And we see things all over the board. So most architects have the tools to really pull in these numbers pretty easily and just put them in a table or something like that. It's kind of what we typically like to see. on the approved set of documents. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. All right, so I'll open it up for a couple minutes to any board comments or questions on this proposed change. Kevin.
Just a question for Ron on that, or sorry, Brad. Are you typically finding those on the architectural drawings or mechanical drawings where that's noted? Or is some of the issue that you're finding it in both places and they're contradictory?
Yeah, we typically see it in the architecturals. I don't know that I've ever seen it in mechanical.
Yeah, Hope.
I have no problem with this language. I think it's good language. The only thing is, I do think it's in the wrong location. If you go into what is now C-105 that talks about all the requirements that need to be placed on the construction documents, it does have a section or a number that deals with air barriers and defining it and so forth. So I think this would be really good in that section, because architects and you would see those on the architectural drawings, they look at that section to see what are the items I need to place on plans. They're not necessarily going to look at C402.6.1 to see what type of information I need to have on the drawings themselves.
Awesome. Thanks, Hope. Brad, does that would that change your proposal, or do you think that suggestion from Hope makes sense?
It's a good comment. I was going to look at that section. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it word for word in a while.
Okay.
Sorry, this one does add, I mean, when we talk about quantifying all those surface areas, that is an additional component of documentation. And I don't think I caught this one as a comment, or I didn't give it careful consideration as to what that means from a documentation point of view, because it's not just drawing a dashed line on the plan and saying this is it, but we're talking, you're quantifying all the volume of all the spaces. So if you take a really big project, a mixed-use building that has hotel, office, and commercial space in it or something like that, that does become quite a lot of scope to add in there to identify all that area that could otherwise, yeah. I don't know. I don't know what we've seen that's been successful about that. We don't typically call out the areas because it's dimensioned on there, and you can derive the areas.
So those testing will have to know those square foot of envelope areas anyway. So the numbers have to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you're performing the test to that square foot of envelope or surface enclosure area, somebody has to calculate that at some point.
Yeah, and from the testing, maybe it's a group 14 question. Is the testing, I mean, Anna, I don't think that's something like we have in our documentation for anything, and I know we work with on you. It's through the tester. So it's kind of shifting where that documentation responsibility occurs. And I have a little hesitation about that.
Yeah, typically we're calculating the area and then what's required.
Okay. So I guess it sounds like there's maybe some hesitation on adding this scope, potential suggestion to move it into section C-105. So in order to keep us moving along, I'd love to do just a quick hand raise with the folks on the board. And this might need Brad, I think our team can follow up with you offline to see about moving it to section 105 and just kind of thinking through some of the nuance of where this would go. But if folks are generally interested in this concept, I guess I'll ask 3 questions. If you're interested in the concept, I'll ask you to raise your hand. If you're not sure and you really want more time to think about it, I'll ask that question and I'll ask you to raise your hand. And if you think that this is not something you're interested in adding, I'll ask that question last. So board members only, if you're interested in adding something akin to this into our proposed changes for the IECC, whether it land here or in section 105 somewhere, please raise your hand now. Okay, I think I see 6 hands. Awesome, thank you guys. If those if folks have questions or still want to think about it and really aren't sure where they're landing, please raise your hand now. Okay, thanks guys. I see 3 hands. And then if this is something you are not in favor of, please raise your hand now. Okay. Okay, awesome. So I had 6 hands up in favor of adding this, 3 who said they want to continue to think about it, and 2 folks that are not in favor of adding this. Oh, thanks, Aaron. I see your chat, so I'm going to make that 7 hands that are in favor.
You have
I
one
think we
from
had
Rob
8.
too.
Ah,
Yeah.
and Rob.
Will,
Okay. Thanks,
sorry,
guys.
and then Will raised his hand at the last
Yeah.
minute too. So,
So
I think we had 7 originally.
So 8 now with Aaron. Yeah, 8 in
Okay.
favor. And then
8
I
in
think there were
favor,
4 who were
who'd like to
questioning.
think about it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah.
guys, for helping me track that. And 2 not in favor. So to me, that's a majority that of folks that want to see this worked in. And so our team can take this offline. Brad will work with you to figure out where this might land. And we can bring it back to the board for more consideration.
And Kevin, I would just maybe encourage you or whoever were in the kind of camp of like not sure or questioning. I would also encourage all of you to think about like, is there something that you could tweak to this language that might make it more palatable or something like that, just to find some middle ground? Because recognizing while 8 is a majority of the people here, 8 is not a majority of the board even. So it's like, you know, we want to land somewhere that people feel comfortable. So if there are ways that you could modify this while keeping the original kind of intent, the spirit of it,
Yeah,
we'd be curious to hear thoughts.
That's kind of what I'm trying to think. I don't want to wordsmith it by committee, of course, but it might be saying the boundary limits and size rather than enumerating all those individual areas, because I feel like that's work that the testers have to do anyways, and indicating graphically where those are rather than quantifying all that data might be a good middle ground. I put in the chat, I support the intent of this. I just want to make sure we don't get a ton of scope creep out of it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And I just want to second Adam's point, and we'll have a space for you all to provide final code proposals before we release a draft with any of this language. Ron.
You're muted, Ron.
I know this comes up on the residential side more, but I guess I'm wondering whether or not there are guidelines and testing protocols that the tester is going to be following, and whether or not by drawing it out, are we going to end up in a situation where maybe we have conflicts between what the drawings say, where the air barrier and testing areas are, versus what the testing protocol that they're following to come up with those measurements.
Anna, do you want to jump in?
So I do know that they do in the 2024 IECC, they have to test in accordance with ASTM E3158. I do not know if that includes the calculation of the air barrier area or volume, so I will check with my team on that.
I kind of think it has to, or else you have to define that area, because that area calculation drives the other part of the calculation, and then you could get into a funny situation where they update the ASTM standard, and I don't know. It just seems like the tester is already required to sort of follow a procedure. So I don't know, just something I'm a little entangled about in my head how that might work.
Yeah, thanks, Ron, for that. And Anna, maybe we can follow up with you offline after you're able to check in with your team, and kind of using some of those insights, Ron, we can come back to the board with a suggestion on what this could look like to make sure that entanglement doesn't happen. I think it's a fair point. We'll go Rob, and then we'll go Andrew.
Yeah, quick question. Like, in looking at the code, how does the area in red differ from any of the requirements in C402.6.1?
I think it's a full edition. So none of the language in red currently is in the 2024 code. Is that your question, Rob?
No, no, no. My question is, isn't what we're adding in red, how is what we're adding in red additive to what's already required in 406.6.6.1?
402.6.6.1.
402.6.1.1, excuse me.
402.
Top of 188. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm like, oh man, I'm never gonna get there. All right, let me stop sharing and get both of these up so you guys can see both at the same time. So Rob, you're referring to the air barrier design and documentation requirements here.
It sounds like what's in red is adding documentation requirements, but there's a section already dedicated to documentation requirements in the code proposal. How are they different? Does that make sense?
It does, and I think what we're not doing in 402.6.1.1 is defining the enclosure area in terms of square footage, which we would be measuring against the air leakage number that we get, the CFM number.
Thanks, Brad. Rob, does that answer your question?
I mean, it does insofar as kind of the calculating the surface area was kind of the part that I saw as onerous, and if that's the only thing that's differentiating it, it kind of changes my my perspective on whether this should move forward.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. If you want to sort of change where your vote fell, I'm happy to reset.
No, I don't want to be that wishy-washy. I'll stay.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Andrew.
How is this not a clear expansion of a not currently existing requirement under 402.6.1.1? If 402.6.1.1 does not clearly address this, this would be in addition to it, and I believe beyond the purview of the board.
Well, I guess I can try to address that. I think there's a difference, Andrew, between something that's additional and something that's more stringent. I don't know that this is requiring, I think to the point Brad was making earlier, this is not requiring something that doesn't already have to be done anyway. It's just making it clearer that it needs to be on the construction documents. So it's not adding any stringency. It's not adding a requirement. It's more just demonstrating where it has to be shown.
Within that context, if I were to agree with that, would it not be under 402.6.1.1 with further subparagraph under 4?
So I think that we can revisit where this needs to live. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time debating today as to like, should this be under 406.1.1 or 402.6.1.1 or 4C105 or whatever. I think that discussion can be taken offline. I think it's more of, do folks think it's an appropriate thing to do at this point?
Thanks, Adam. I agree, and I think given that we did an initial vote, and it seems like the majority of folks here are interested in seeing this move forward, I'm going to suggest we take this offline and keep us moving through our proposals, because we have quite a few more to get through. So the next proposal is, I'll just keep it in this view for a moment in case we need to pull the code back up, was a suggestion by Kevin, and thanks for flagging this. There is one word in this section that should read comprise versus compromise. We expect that they'll change this in the IECC. We just wanted to give this as an FYI to folks. This is like one of those language cleanup pieces we would absolutely do if the IECC doesn't catch it, just because it changes the entire intent of that section. So just an FYI, and I'm going to keep us moving along. So the third code proposal here is to remove the section that would require folks to go back and fix any parts of their envelope in order to hit that air leakage CFM per square foot. So Kim, I believe this was your co-proposal, and would welcome you to unmute and share any of your thoughts, and then we'll open this up for board discussion.
It was not mine.
Well, so Kim, I think we tried to infer from your perspective that you shared in the commercial survey that was asking to have the requirement to go back and fix leaks if buildings failed tests, and this is the requirement that has that. So this is our attempt at reflecting that comment from you.
I was not able to fill out the survey, so it wasn't my comment.
Oh.
I'm not sure who it might have been.
That's weird.
There's another imposter Kim who submitted notes on your behalf then, Kim. That's very confusing. Well, if this
did anyone submit a proposal to not require buildings to go back and fix if they fail leakage tests? Andrew, was that you? Okay. That's weird.
No, I didn't submit it. It's a interesting topic though, because it could create an appearance of an ongoing duty, which I don't think at least wouldn't be my intent. So with it, looking at it on the screen, I would actually be more inclined to support it now seeing it, but even though I didn't initiate it.
Interesting. we have a ghost proposer here.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Carolyn.
And no, it was not me either, but I think I appreciate that whatever Ghost put it on there, put this forward, because I think this gets at the earlier discussion we were having around remedy. I think there's some useful parts of this remedy language that gets a little bit of what Kevin had raised, because it explicitly says where sealing of leaks can be made without damaging existing building components, right? So that's getting at, you don't necessarily have to rip out drywall or make it so invasive. So I would advocate for keeping something here, and to the extent that we're concerned about the stringency of the requirement and the cost of the remedy, we could potentially, further work on this language. That makes it that we want reasonable efforts to correct leakage, but very clear that the intent is not to require invasive remedy. And then, jurisdictions that want to require invasive remedy can certainly go above that. But I think from a minimum standard, there should be something, and or even offering something that doesn't leave it undetermined. So that jurisdictions adopting this may think that has to be invasive. So I just wanted to name that as, I wouldn't advocate for deleting it. I'd be open to refining it if folks, per the earlier discussion, have some recommendations.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Tim, and then Kevin, and then Kristen.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of heartburn about what that added exception, and I'd be in support of deleting that as an AHJ. From a timing standpoint, in going through the process to get a project completed, certificate of occupancy issued, I have enough trouble like going through life safety and fire safety and getting them through that to get people moved in or businesses open. And I think I'd be struggling to try to deny a certificate of occupancy based on that compliance portion. So that's, at least from an enforceability standpoint, that's my 2 cents.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Tim, I mean, if it fails a test, it wouldn't pass inspection.
Well, it's a report that's turned in at the end, is my understanding. Is that not correct? The way you've been enforcing it?
No, I mean, if the building doesn't pass the air leakage test, it doesn't pass inspection. And therefore it has to be remedied. There's always the question of what is the remedy? Like, how far do you have to keep doing it over and over again until it passes? Or do you make reasonable, or do you have to prove that you took reasonable measures to try and correct the leakage. But if you submit a report that shows it didn't pass a requirement of construction, it won't pass inspection.
It would not pass.
No, it would not pass, and it would not get its CO. It'd have to correct it. Be no different than, the smoke detectors failed to properly communicate, or the window, the windows that were installed weren't the proper U rating as per the design documents. Take your pick. It's one of the requirements that didn't pass.
I would agree. And I think then it becomes AHJ's responsibility to make that priority decision of that at the time of a CO, life safety, fire safety, and then the energy compliance. But I'm not saying that's what I would do, but I know that jurisdictions have the priority list of what I just said, fire safety, life safety, accessibility, and then the energy down at a lower level. But that's just the way I've seen it, and colleagues of mine that I've seen it. But trying to get a building open, get people moved in, say an apartment project or a retail building open. So at some point, if it doesn't comply, to withhold a CO would be a challenge for any building official.
And I think maybe it's important to point out Hope's comment there, that this is not requiring that it go back and be, Hope, if you can clarify, it's not requiring that it goes back and be retested, right? It's only requiring that they have to demonstrate that measures were taken to address the leakage. So it's not like there would be, the next step would be that, oh, well, they fail again, then they still don't get their CO. So I think that that's an important clarification, maybe, because Tim, it sounds like you're concerned about like it having to be retested over and over again. And all this is saying is, well, you don't have to retest it over and over again, but you just have to go seal up the leaks.
I would agree with that statement, which seems odd to put something in to say you don't. It's why I think a lot of building departments don't enforce radon, because the provisions or the appendices, because it doesn't say you have to keep testing and testing until you get that particularly down. But so
right.
I'm going to be kind of voting to get that exception, that everything read out.
Hey, sorry, I do want to just clarify with Hope really quickly, because it does say corrective actions must be made to the building and an additional test completed for which the results are 0.45 or less.
Yeah,
oh yeah. I was looking, I missed that part, but yeah,
and for what it's worth, that's the part I was thinking, like if we wanted to revisit that specific requirement as the minimum. But to your point is, they should do all of that before submitting the documentation to get their certificate of occupancy, right? So it's not, I don't know. I'm not going to argue with Tim's point on this, but I agree with Kim Wills in the chat that we would require it to be corrected if it didn't meet the requirements. Which doesn't mean that we don't put the other ones higher above, or we come up with some, remedy, like temporary or certificate or something like that. But I think that's left to jurisdictions for how they want to deal with failure to comply with that element. But I like the idea of clarifying how you remedy as a minimum, as opposed to leaving it open-ended, because I think that's where the issue comes up.
Yeah, and I think if you strike it all together, you kind of give people a get out of jail free card. They're like, oh, we didn't pass. Too bad. We, we still get our CO. There's no implication. There's no teeth to it.
Thanks, Kevin.
That was my exact comment as well. Sorry.
Awesome. No, glad you jumped in. Thanks, Brad. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna just I've asked my team. I can't pull up the survey while I've got all of my screen sharing going on right now, but we'll figure out, we'll get to the bottom of who submitted this as part of their survey results. But it sounds like there's a couple of options coming up. I think some folks are potentially interested in modifying this exception language. So Carolyn, I think this was sort of your suggestion. to require reasonable efforts versus invasive remedy, and just making sure that we do our due diligence and making sure that code language is clear. And then I'm sort of also hearing like let's not change it and let's strike it all together. So let's go through those three options and just do quick hand raises again so we can kind of get a general sense of how folks across the board are feeling. So if you would like to strike this exception altogether, Adam, do you want to have a comment first before we?
Just a little, I mean, maybe want to understand Carolyn's better.
Yeah,
because
I would preserve it. I would only offer that if we're concerned about Kevin's earlier comment or questions that he raised around this particular issue, that I'd be open to modifying it. I'm fine with what it says. This would be fine.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I was trying to clarify was it says that it should be all leaks shall be sealed without damaging existing building
Correct.
components. So that to me seems like that kind of addresses the invasive. Like if you're having to rip something out to seal a leak, it's saying you don't have to do that.
Yeah. So I was definitely advocating to keep this provision. So I just wanted to say that if we wanted to be a little bit more clear and refined, I'm open to that, but I don't have a specific proposal.
Okay.
So I would vote to keep it.
Okay. So then we'll keep it simple. Kristen, I'll let you jump in and then we'll do a quick vote.
I concur with the comment in the chat about I'd propose we table this until we figure out who this is actually coming from. I'm uncomfortable voting on things when we're not even 100% certain a board member put it forward.
Sure. Okay. I think that's also fine. So I guess what that just adds another layer to our voting. So I think let's just hands up if you don't want to make any changes, and I'll kind of bucket that with like, let's just table, we want to table this and not proceed with any changes to this section. Please raise your hand. Okay.
And
awesome.
just a clarification, no changes to this section means we are rejecting what you're showing on the screen.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, I saw 12 hands total up at one point, so you guys can lower your hands. Thank you all. If anyone is interested in preserving something like what you guys see on the screen, where this exception is struck, please raise your hand. Okay. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Andrew. You can lower your hand. So I had one vote to keep it struck. So I think the clear majority is to leave it as is, and we'll provide another opportunity if folks have any interest in making changes to this section. But it seems like, again, apologies to the board, not sure how a ghost proposal snuck its way into our survey.
Yeah, and we can also follow up with the whole board in an email and say that we had this proposal. No one who's on the call today, if it was anyone on the call today, no one's fessing up, and if there are board members who are not here. So it is very possible that that was just a confusion and that it is a board member who's not here. So we can also follow up to see if anyone who was not here wants to take credit for it.
Yep, thanks, Adam. Okay, so for our final proposal in the air leakage section, this was to change section 402.6.2.3 to add the text that you see in red here. So the inspection of continuous air barrier components and assemblies shall be conducted during the construction to verify compliance with the requirements of those sections that I am not going to read out loud because it is very long, by the approved third-party air leakage agency. This is the new section. The air barrier and air sealing inspection report shall be provided to the building owner or owner's authorized agent and the code official at the time of framing or insulation inspection. The air barrier shall remain accessible for inspection and repair. So this question or this comment, I believe, came from either Brad or Kevin. Brad, I think this might have been you.
It was me, and I'll make this really quick, but I'll start by saying, again, we have been performing air tightness testing in City of Fort Collins to a much tighter metric than is in code for a long time, and have been largely successful with it. This input was put into our code at the request of discussions with a couple of the large commercial air tightness test agencies that we work with on a regular basis. Right now we have 6 total approved air leakage test agencies in town. So 2 of those agencies gave me direct feedback on inclusion of this. And the reason is this avoids or increases the odds that you'll avoid a failure, and it allows the discussion to start to happen early on in the process rather than 2 weeks out from CO. A builder or a developer reaching out to an air leakage test firm and saying, hey, city's requiring that we come and do an air tightness test on this building, come out. And at that point, the air leakage test firm has not had eyes on the building at all. So if at time of framing or insulation inspection that there is the ability of the code official or a building inspector to ask that question or ask for the air leakage test agency's report on it, it increases the odds that they'll be contracted much earlier on in the process. The result of this has been dramatic in Fort Collins. When those air leakage test firms are involved in the project from the get-go, the likelihood that they will pass at first test is much, much higher. The people that get brought in 2 weeks prior to CO and have not seen the building, there's a much higher likelihood that that building will fail its first air leakage test, and then they will have to perform diagnostics to find and mitigate the air leakage. So this just ensures that we get those people on board earlier. They're going to hire them anyway. It just says, hey, you need to have them on board earlier on in the process.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that background, Brad. Tim, I see your hand. I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Mo.
Yeah, thanks. I agree on that concept of earlier the better, but with the large projects that we routinely deal with, multi-story residential, I've got multi-story commercial, don't have multi-story retail. And every one of those projects that I've had my ongoing and previous history have been doing partials. They'll be doing framing on first floor, third floor, whatever that might be, insulation, drywall, and then working up or down or across the large floor plate. So this would be a challenge with the way the language says that. It sounds like then that testing agency would have to be out doing some kind of partial air barrier test on, say, a quarter of the building or a floor plate, and then come back and keep coming back, and it's going to increase the cost. No doubt, the point of trying to be in early makes sense, but I think this would be quite onerous. And I wish I had some developers or builders. I know Andrew's on there from single family, but on a multifamily, I don't see that's workable language.
Thanks, Tim. Brad, did you want to reply to that quickly before we go to Mo?
Yeah, just real quick. I think Tim had mentioned that it was a test. This is not a test. This is just an approved or an air leakage test firm that is on site inspecting. They've been on site and they've made some observations. That's all that this is saying. There's no testing involved at this point.
Thanks for that clarification, Brad.
Could I follow up with a question to that, Brad? I just see the language, maybe I'm not reading it. It says the air barrier and air sealing inspection report shall be provided. So what would that, if you're using something similar in Fort Collins, what does the report say?
So that's not an air leakage report. That's just an air barrier and air sealing inspection. Similar to what we do, like a HERS rater would do on the residential side. So typically they're getting called in at rough and going out and doing air barrier and air sealing inspection. Same type of thing. When you have an air leakage test firm contracted early on in the project, they will dictate a schedule. They will often tell the builder when they need to be on site and view some of those things, air barrier and air sealing details. If they don't have the opportunity to do that and the building fails, they just throw their hands up and go, we haven't seen anything in the building. We have no documentation. We don't know how it's constructed. So the whole idea behind this is to increase the likelihood of passing the air leakage test on the first attempt.
I agree with that. If the point of that is, then this, I think that it needs to be clarified better and codified with better language too, because I just don't. I know that residential builders that we work with that do the performance, they'll bring in somebody like Robbie Schwartz or whoever, Group 14, and they will send a person through before they drywall to make sure that they've sealed up bottom plates, top plates, et cetera, which will, increase that likelihood. But that's by their choice. I'm not sure codifying that is the right thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So commercial air leakage test firms want to do that if they're contracted early enough.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Brad. Mo, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep this brief. And Tim, I might need your help here. I'm just thinking about the modular product and how that would work with this. It's something, when I used to be involved more directly with modular, it's something we struggled greatly with when we were on the 2015 IECC, let alone moving to the 2021. And Tim, I've not been part of the conversations the Technical Advisory Committee has had on this subject, but I'm just curious, when you're dealing with a product that some of it, in some instances, most of it is built off-site. We also have different products where they're partially built off-site and they're finished on-site. I can see like a lot of the on-site work being done in those latter categories. But for those products that are primarily done, completed off-site, how does all this fit into that effectively for that product? And we don't want to discourage that product. We want to find a way to make this work with that product. So I'm just curious if any thoughts have been given to that, and if people see this language working with that product or being an issue with it. I hope that makes sense. And Robbie Schwartz is also on the Technical Advisory Committee, so perhaps he's already provided some insight into that, and I just missed it.
Yeah, that concern has come up on numerous the technical advisory committees from the manufacturers, and now including the tiny home builders. Now that's been included, that program has now been included through state legislation, and it's the requirement of doing that testing and who's going to be doing that testing, both on residential and commercial units, and especially when you have multiple units. Like if you see these bigger buildings, whether it's a hotel or apartment building or something, even office buildings, they come out in sections, and then they've got to pin it together and somehow tie them together with a good air barrier. So that is a question that keeps coming up on the TAC. As they've gone to the 21, they haven't started the discussion on the 2024 yet. They've got a couple of years left to go.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for that question, Mo. And I just want to call out a couple of the comments in the chat. So if folks want to direct their attention to those as we're going through this conversation. Andrew and then Kim.
I view this proposal in a similar view as the first proposal. I believe this proposal is misplaced in the incorrect reference. It would go under 402.611, and I believe it's making the documentation requirement more than the code intended, consistent with my comment on the first proposal.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So consider that this might need to go in a different section. Kim?
I just wanted to chime in as an inspector, third-party inspector, that yes, I feel like this requirement would help ensure that the inspection, that a third-party inspector is called on site in a timely manner to inspect what needs to. Also, from my experience, just from the testing standpoint, let alone from looking at the air barrier, it was multiple visits over and over and over that was required. So I'm not quite sure, what the experience is as far as the timing of when the verification could be provided. but I kind of hear what both Brad and Tim are saying from this perspective on this. And yes, for modular, all those inspections have to be done at the construction, where the modulars are being built, prior to them coming to be on site, unless something is going to be visible on site when it gets there. So a third-party rater has to travel to that location where it's being constructed to do those inspections, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think that is really helpful perspective. Okay, so I don't see any other hands, and so I'd love to do just a quick temperature check on how folks are feeling. Sort of generally seeing there being two options here. We can choose to take this out of the language here. So basically keep the language as is, or add some version of Brad's suggested change into the code language, whether it be here or in a more appropriate section, and we can take that offline with Hope to and Anna to figure out what that should be. So if you would like to keep the proposal from Brad in some shape or form in this code, please raise your hand now. Okay, wonderful. I see 8 hands up. Thank you, guys. You can lower them. And then if you would not like to include Brad's proposal as something that we add to the code, please raise your hand now. Okay, and I see 2 hands. Rob, I'm sorry, I caught you right at the end. Were you in favor?
I was lowering my hand.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I'm in favor of keeping this proposed language.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Rob. Okay, so I see 2 hands against. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Andrew. So we will keep this piece in and work with our team offline to figure out the right place for it and kind of adapt the language maybe as needed based on today's conversation. Tim.
Yeah, I would be interested in something like this with some modified code language that might give a little clarity, you know, for some of the comment. I mean, I'm fully in agreement with getting out there early, but to, you know, a report, maybe change, modifying the language, and I could be swayed to go into the red, yes, or whatever you want to call it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And I just want to note that Carolyn and Mo both did not vote and through that they were undecided in the chat. So I appreciate you guys adding that. And we will, I think the majority is still in favor of keeping some version of this. So we'll move forward with that assumption. Okay, so the next section, I'll jump back into presenter view, is related to insulation and fenestration requirements. And because we are, of course, running out of time, we're gonna just quickly breeze through these questions. I'll kind of share the questions with everybody, and then just to note those of you who asked questions, not that we don't want to answer those live, but we'll look to follow up with you guys and provide answers to the full board via email after this meeting, just because we want to make sure we can get through as much discussion as possible. As we get to the strengthening comments, I think the big question once we propose those to the board is going to be, are you all interested in thinking about how we integrate this into an optional C406 requirement? Because per our initial review, none of the strengthening comments in this section attach to any of our appendices. So we'll kind of try to get through a couple of those first two pieces, and then we'll see how much of the neutral and weakening comments we can get through in this session. Okay, so just to share these questions really quickly, what is the context behind adding section C402.1.4 and what does it mean for assembly performance? And so again, we'll provide, Hope and Anna will kind of work with you guys to provide a response to this. And then the context, what is the context around equation 4.1, which is the aged roof solar reflectance equation, and how has that changed? So more comments or more answers to those coming following this meeting. And now we'll move on to the strengthening proposals. So there were 2 proposals. One was sort of a light suggestion, perhaps, rather than a proposal for strengthening this section of the code. So the first proposal is to require slab-on-grade insulation across all code paths without thermal breaks. We'll show the language for that in a moment. And then the second proposal, as you'll see, is to consider further improvements to the table C402.5. And so again, we'll consider whether or not those are possible. Before we jump in, Anna, would love to hear your thoughts.
Sorry. On the questions that were asked, I just want to confirm equation 4.1 is the component performance method calculation, not the aged. And I just want to make sure I know, Kevin, you asked that one. Were you looking at the aged roof solar reflectance equation or the
performance one? Thank you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure because that's what I was answering.
Thanks, Anna. I'll fix that on the slide. That was me who pulled that in incorrectly. So my bad. So again, I'll just kind of show you guys these strengthening proposals. The second one that we received did not have any proposed changes to the table. It was just a suggestion or question on whether the board wanted to make further changes to the table. But for that first proposal, this is on the top of this is on page 179 of the code book for section C402.2.4. Where installed, the perimeter insulation for slab on grade shall be placed on the outside of the foundation or on the inside of the foundation wall. For installations complying with table C402.1.3, the perimeter insulation shall extend downward from the top of the slab for minimum distance shown in the table or to the top of the footing, whichever is less, or downward to not less than the bottom of the slab, and then horizontally to the interior or exterior for the total distances shown in the table. New section, and shall be installed as continuous insulation and without thermal breaks, where horizontal sections of the insulation are weight supportive as a structural thermal material with an R value not less than R3 shall suffice to maintain an insulation without thermal breaks. And then the section continues. I think, again, and then this is the look at that table C402.5 and what is currently in the code. This is on page 184. So I'm going to bring us back to this sort of slide here and just pose the question to the board. Are folks interested in looking and our team looking at ways in which we can consider some of these strengthening proposals in something like an optional C406 amendment, or do we not want to spend our time here? So Tim, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So back to the original clarification that Adam got us in the beginning for proposal one, that would appear to me that we would, as a board, we would not be able to do that as written, but it would have to be brought in some fashion from an appendix, and I don't see an appendix that actually could be modified to do that. Would that be correct?
That's true, Tim, except that I would make the caveat when it comes to like providing additional options in something like C406. You're not increasing the stringency, you're just giving more options to meet those points, right? Because it's not mandatory. You can choose that or not choose that. So I think that that's where the question is about, like, do we want to discuss these rather than making them in the changes in the sections that they're proposed in currently? Do we want to consider other ways to like give optional credit to do something better, like in the C406 context?
Understood. And I would agree with that concept. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Okay. Any initial thoughts from board members on is this the path that we think we want to go down? And we can focus the discussion on these two pieces once we get to sections, our discussion on section C406, or, I will offer as well that, if the board is not certain at this point, that there are a lot of things that the board about that we do want to discuss that could take up this time. So before we just skipped these, we did want to make sure that the board agrees that on the direction we want to take for this. So any thoughts? Kevin?
It might be worth, because I was the person who said, those seem like fairly minor improvements in the U values on the windows. That's the only thing that changed on that between 21 and 25. And, certainly we see U values lower than that on a regular basis. Does anyone in this group have context as to how those numbers were arrived at? Was that something that was extensively negotiated by the code committees and all to date? I'm looking at the one that has the markup of what was and what is proposed. So for what matters for us, zone 5, it's only going from 0.36 to 0.34. Yeah, thanks. And it might be, Anna or Hope, like when you've seen this, how much does that really move the needle, or is 0.02 really a massive step that is already pretty aggressive?
Yeah. So, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that when these were presented to the committee, what I will tell you is there are a lot of the fenestration and glazing manufacturing industry who participates. Now, remember, commercial glazing and residential glazing fall under two categories, where we can have really aggressive U factor. For residential, it's very plausible because they're kind of mass produced and they're able to do it. A lot of the commercial items are one-offs. They have some, but they're not mass produced, so they can't get those U factors that you may be able to get on the residential side. Now, as far as the numbers that you may or may not be seeing, sometimes what happens with that, it's the center of glass U factor that gets provided and not the assembly U factor that gets provided. The assembly U factor is what we would see on this screen because the center of glass is going to be drastically reduced number compared to what is in the table. I would say with the discussions that happen, these are probably what the industry and the manufacturing can produce at this time that's reasonable as far as cost and technology feasibility.
Mm-hmm.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
I agree. I think that we typically don't see, so if we have like a standard low E in a thermally broken aluminum frame for a storefront system, you're probably at a 0.37, 0.38, not a 0.34.
Got it. So this is already a challenge. I would kind of then pull back the suggestion to change it anymore.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I think that's helpful. All right.
And then I just wanted to add a comment on the slab on grade proposal. In our experience with energy modeling, we've found that slab on grade and foundation insulation is oftentimes not installed continuous with above grade insulation, which is what makes it work. If there is a thermal bridge between where the above grade continuous insulation ends and the foundation insulation begins, that foundation insulation is doing essentially nothing. We also have found that in climate zones 4 and 5, it has minimal impact to energy use intensity reduction, particularly for multi-story buildings. In climate zone 6, it makes more impact. In climate zone 7, it makes a lot of impact. But I don't think that it is something that we've seen shows significant enough impact that buildings will see any sort of payback.
Thanks, Anna. I also wanted to share, Elizabeth was not able to make our meeting today, but she did share a thought on this proposal as well. It sounds like agrees kind of with Anna. I disagree with the slab edge insulation. This is simply another thermal bridge. Mandating slab edge insulation is unenforceable when considering the structural complexities for commercial buildings, and we cannot create an unenforceable code. Local jurisdictions can increase the stringency as they wish and then deal with the unenforceability on a case-by-case basis, but most jurisdictions cannot. So I just wanted to make sure we communicated her thoughts on this proposal as well. And then Ron, I'll go to you.
I was just going to sort of add on to that a little bit that I think slab edge insulation, the detailing for that is definitely one of the places where design teams get really tripped up and confused and contractors have trouble following the drawings. It's just a place where there's a lot of challenges to make it work.
Thanks, Ron. Okay. So I think we'll kind of do the same 2 votes. Hands up if you are interested in us considering, and we'll take this offline, how our team could think about integrating this into an optional C406 pathway, because again, we cannot make these direct strengthening changes in the code language, or those who would like to not include this. So if you would like us to keep this suggestion in, or consider how to integrate this suggestion into the code, please raise your hand now. If you would like us to do that, please raise your hand. Okay. Awesome. So I see one hand raised in favor. Thanks, Brad. And then if you would not like to move forward with thinking about how we add this into the code, please raise your hand. Okay, thanks everyone. I see 7 no's, and then I guess just to keep consistent with what we did before, if you're not sure and you just have more questions or don't really know, don't have an opinion on this quite yet, please raise your hand. Grab you guys. Okay, awesome. So we had 1, keep it in, 3, need more information, and 7, take it out. So by way of simple majority, that would kind of lead us to taking this out. If folks are super motivated to get this in as an optional consideration in C406, I would just suggest that anyone coordinate with us offline or send us any proposals on how you might see this showing up in C406 when we get to that point. Okay. So we have 5 minutes left, and with that time, I don't think we're going to be able to have any more productive conversation about code proposals. Man, that loss of an hour in these meetings, I know it's probably better for everyone's mental state, but it really truly cuts out some really good discussion time. So I think Adam and I will get our heads together after this and figure out how we can make sure we get you guys' thoughts on these final code proposals. It'll likely look something like a quick follow-up survey. Just to note that there were 2 proposals for weakening or what they were for weakening this section of the code. We will share these in more detail. And then when it got to the thermal bridging section, there were really just questions that came from the board. So again, with the questions, same with the questions from insulation, we'll follow up with everybody with answers to those questions via email. We're not going to get to this. And then we clearly didn't have time to talk about the renewable energy section. So likely we'll pivot most of this discussion to our next meeting. And because we recognize that last meeting board members flagged that we want to have this conversation before we jump into C406. And so we'll start here, and we may include some follow-up questions for you guys in a survey about how your leanings for this section. I'm just going to scroll through. We obviously did not get a chance to cover the commercial major changes in C502 and C503 today, but Adam, I'll look to you. I think we'll try to send this out to you guys after the meeting so you all can look at it in your own time. And maybe we'll just ask that you guys kind of do that as pre-work before we start that C406 discussion and bring any questions you have forward. So with that, I'm going to scroll very quickly through all of these changes to our next steps so we can wrap up on time today. Okay, so our next meeting is meeting 11, and it's Thursday, July 25th from 9 to 11 a.m. The focus of meeting 11 will, I believe, we'll be starting with kind of wrap up from this meeting, discussion on C405-15, and then moving into the discussion around C406. We'll get meeting minutes out to you guys as soon as possible. And as always, we'll approve those at the start of the next meeting. And then just know that our team has been working diligently. Both Anna and Adam have started to compile different pathways and scenarios that work for section C406. And so I just wanted to let the board know that we're to compile a bunch of information for you guys to kind of help with that discussion and review. And as much as we're able to share before we start that discussion, we will. Adam, anything to add?
I think the other thing I'm just going to add is the same thing I generally say at the end of every meeting, is that I just really encourage everybody to please be looking at the proposals from your fellow board members, and questions that you have that come up that can be answered that don't necessarily require discussion. You're welcome to email those to us in advance. We can include Anna and Hope in those comments and try to get you answers ahead of time. And I just really am hoping that folks aren't seeing these proposals for the first time in these meetings. Like, I think we really need to be, as is evident today, we didn't even get through all of the envelope discussion in 2 hours or an hour and a half of discussion. And so I think I just really want to emphasize that, like, if we have board members, who come to these meetings and these are the first time you all are really reacting to these proposals. That takes a lot of time to have those kind of reactions take place in these meetings. And I would love to have those reactions take place outside of these meetings and questions be answered between us, between our subject matter experts and others ahead of time, if possible. I realize discussion brings up some questions, and I realize that's unavoidable. But if there are questions that you come up with now ahead of time, we would love to have those addressed sooner so that we can spend more time on robust discussion and less time on clarification. So I would just like to put that out. I realize that we ask a lot of you, and I really want to emphasize how much we appreciate your time and your expertise on this, but just recognizing that that's important if we want to be as productive as we can with our time.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, Tim, did you want to share your thought?
Yeah, if I could just suggest, I agree with that. To be prepared, it would be helpful to help me, to see the agenda more than a couple days beforehand, and maybe like a week before, and maybe like before a weekend, since it's my time where I spend being a code geek, I guess. But that would help a lot. Sorry, thanks.
Yeah, no, Tim, and that's a very fair point. And fully take ownership for the fact that the agenda didn't get out until yesterday. I apologize with the 4th of July holiday. Just it totally slipped my mind, and so that is not an excuse, but it won't happen moving forward. And we'll try again, absolutely, to make sure you guys are aware of the agendas and have the materials you need to review well in advance of our next meeting, ideally with a weekend in between. So. Okay, with that, it's 1 p.m. So we'll say thank you guys so much for the discussion and for showing up today. Appreciate all your guys' time, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.